Hey, my name is Asher Doyle. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Millbrook, Vermont, the kind of town where people still wave from their porches when your truck goes by. For 8 years I've worked as a paramedic, which means I'm very good at exactly one thing: staying steady when everything around me is falling apart. It's the part of my life that's never given me trouble, the part where the thing falling apart is my own heart, not a stranger's. That part I've spent 8 years actively avoiding. I was avoiding it again on a Tuesday afternoon in April, sitting in a leather chair in Thomas Alden's law office on Main Street, waiting for him to read my uncle's will. Desmond Doyle had died 2 weeks earlier, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of ending the doctor called peaceful, and I still hadn't managed to believe. He was the closest thing to a real father I ever had. My own dad worked offshore rigs most of my childhood and never quite learned how to come home from them, so it was Desmond who taught me to drive. Desmond who sat with me the night I decided to become a paramedic instead of finishing the business degree my mother wanted for me. Desmond who never once, in 33 years, made me feel like I was too much or not enough. Thomas Alden had a stack of papers in front of him, and a habit of clearing his throat before he said anything that mattered. He checked the clock. "There's one more party joining us. Should be here any minute." I assumed it was my cousin Vance. Desmond had 2 brothers, and Vance and I were the last nephews left between them. Different fathers, same last name, the same uncle who'd been more of a father to both of us than either of ours ever managed. Vance and Desmond had never been particularly close, but blood was blood, and I figured he'd earned a seat at the table. The door opened. It wasn't Vance, it was Wren. I hadn't seen Wren Sutter in 8 years. Not really. Not close enough to notice that her hair was shorter now, pulled back the way people wear it when they've spent the morning hunched over a drafting table. She stopped in the doorway like she'd walked into the wrong room. "Asher, Wren." That was the whole reunion. 8 years compressed into 2 names, spoken like passwords neither of us was sure still worked. She sat down across from me, as far as the small office allowed, and set a folder on her knees like it might protect her from something. Alden cleared his throat again. "Now that we're all here, the house, the lake house, the one Desmond built with his own hands the year he married my Aunt Ruth, the one with the porch that faced Fenwick Lake and the wood stove that never quite drew right in a north wind, had been left to the 2 of us, not split into 2 properties. Not one of us buying the other out. Equal, undivided shares in the whole of it," Alden read. Slow enough that he wanted it to land exactly right. Neither of us could sell, rent, or change so much as a fence line without the other's signature. Alden glanced at me over his glasses. He was very specific about the wording. I told him it was unusual. He told me he knew exactly what he was doing. I looked at Wren. She was staring at the folder in her lap, jaw tight, and I understood, the way you understand weather changing before it arrives, that she hadn't known either. Whatever Desmond had planned, he'd planned it alone, and we were only now finding out we were standing in the middle of it. Alden slid one more thing across the desk. A plain envelope, sealed, my name on the front in Desmond's blocky handwriting. "Separate from the will. He asked me to give it to you privately." I put it in my jacket pocket, where it sat like a stone for the rest of the meeting. We walked out onto Main Street together, because there wasn't really a way not to. Wren stopped by her car and looked at me the way you look at someone you used to know everything about and now don't know at all. "I guess we have to figure this out." "I guess we do." She got in her car and pulled away, and it wasn't until I was halfway to my own truck that I realized I'd been holding my breath the whole meeting, waiting for her to say something else, something that never came. I called my shift supervisor before I'd even left downtown and asked for 2 weeks I hadn't planned on needing. She didn't ask why. In a town this size, everybody already knew whose will had been read that morning. Alden called that evening, after I'd sat outside the lake house for 20 minutes without going in. There's something else you should know. The town's been sending Desmond notices since last year. Property taxes. It's built up over about 2 years. His medical costs ate through what savings he had, and the tax bills stopped getting paid somewhere along the way. $28,600, he told me. The tax collector had already started proceedings before he died. Millbrook doesn't let a delinquency run past a year without moving toward a sale. The date's set, 4 weeks out. Even if it went to sale, Alden said, Vermont gave you a year afterward to redeem it. Pay off what was owed, plus whatever the buyer had put in, interest and fees included, and take the place back. That wasn't the kind of year either of us could afford to spend clawing back something that already belonged to us, fighting some stranger's claim on top of the debt we already owed. 4 weeks, then, to keep it from getting that complicated. Alden chose his next words more carefully. Your cousin's called my office twice since the funeral, asking about next steps. Mentioned a buyer he knows, some development company that's been picking up shoreline properties around the lake. I'm not saying that means anything. I'm saying it's worth knowing. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after he hung up, looking at the house through the windshield. The porch swing still had the dent in the cushion where Ren and I used to try to fit onto a seat built for one person. Back when I was 22 and thought that kind of crowding was the whole point of being in love. I didn't go inside that night. I drove home instead, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the envelope. Desmond's letter wasn't long. Asher, it said. I've spent the last 4 years not knowing what to do with something that was never mine to keep. It's in my lake journal, on the shelf by the wood stove in the back, where I've kept it safe. I never read past the first line, not because I wasn't curious, but because it wasn't addressed to me. Whatever you decide once you find it, decide it together with her, not around her. Don't let 2 proud people turn 8 years into 20. The house was never really the point. Love, Uncle Des. I read it 3 times. I didn't understand most of it yet, but I understood enough to know that whatever waited on that shelf had something to do with why Ren Sutter had looked at me in that law office like I was a stranger, wearing a face she used to trust. She showed up 4 days later, on a Saturday, her car already in the gravel drive by the time I got there with a box of trash bags and a level I didn't yet know I'd need. I found her in the kitchen, running one hand along the counter like she was checking it for termites, or maybe just looking for a reason not to look at me directly. I figured you'd want to sell, I offered, because it was easier than saying anything true. Boston's a long drive from a leaking roof. She turned around fast enough that I knew I'd guessed wrong. This is the only place that ever felt like it was mine. I'm not selling my half to strangers so they can turn it into a rental with a hot tub. She ran a hand along the doorframe, where a decade of pencil marks still climbed toward the ceiling, dates scratched in beside them. Desmond used to measure me every summer, right here, same as you. I used to tell him I wanted to build houses because of this one. He never let me forget I said that. I hadn't expected that. I'd spent 8 years building a version of her in my head, the one who left for a bigger life and never looked back. And she was standing in my uncle's kitchen, defending a house she hadn't set foot in for who knew how long, with a fierceness that didn't match the story I'd told myself. Then we fix it, both of us, whatever that takes. Something eased in her shoulders, the way ice gives before it actually cracks. We might have stood there another minute working out whether that was a truce or just a ceasefire, if Nora Fitch hadn't let herself in through the screen door without knocking, the way she'd been doing since before either of us could reach the doorknob. She set a casserole dish down on the counter like she was staking a claim to it. I saw both your cars. She'd run the diner on the corner of Main and Birch longer than I could remember, and she'd known Desmond longer than Ren or I had been alive. She looked between us with the satisfaction of a woman who'd been waiting years for this exact scene. About time, which could have meant the house, or could have meant us, and she didn't clarify which. She stayed long enough to tell us the casserole needed 40 minutes at 3:50, and to mention, almost as an aside, that Desmond had taken a bad fall the winter before, cracked his hip, slowed down enough that he needed help he was too stubborn to ask his own nephews for, and that Vance had been coming around ever since, practically living in that mailbox. Nora shook her head. Real helpful, that boy. Always so eager to carry things in for your uncle. She said it lightly. The way you say something you haven't decided yet is worth worrying about. On her way out, she squeezed Wren's hand and paused at the door long enough to add one more thing. Your uncle used to sit at my counter every Sunday and tell me the two of you would figure yourselves out eventually. Man was stubborn as a fence post about most things. Never once doubted that, though. Then the screen door banged behind her the same way it always had, and she was gone before either of us could ask what exactly he'd meant by it. Wren looked at me. Vance was helping him with the mail? First I'm hearing of it. Neither of us said anything else about it that day, but I noticed she filed it away the same careful way I did, tucked behind her eyes for later. The days after that blurred into phone calls about insurance riders and a shared spreadsheet Wren set up without asking whether I wanted one. Both of us learning to talk to each other again through the safest subjects available: deductibles, contractor quotes, whether the dock needed replacing before ice season. It wasn't much. It was also the first time in 8 years either of us had a reason to text the other back. We spent the following Tuesday evening going through Desmond's desk, an old roll top in the corner of the front room, stuffed with 40 years of receipts and fishing licenses and birthday cards he'd never once thrown away. Wren found a folder of tax notices tucked behind a stack of seed catalogs, half of them still sealed, one with a coffee ring on it that looked recent enough to turn my stomach. Some of these are from last spring. She spread them across the table. Before he even had the fall. I hadn't known she knew about the fall at all, and the fact that she did meant she'd been more present in his last 2 years than I had. Driving up from Boston on weekends, I hadn't managed to make it 20 minutes from my own apartment. That particular guilt sat down next to me and didn't leave for the rest of the night. We were still sorting through the notices when headlights swept the front window. Vance let himself out of his truck like he owned the driveway, and by the time he reached the porch, he already had the smile on, the one he used to wear right before he asked to borrow something he had no intention of returning. He stepped inside without quite being invited. Figured I'd catch you both here eventually. He was a few years older than me, had been since we were kids, and never once let me forget it. His eyes went to the papers on the table, then away from them fast enough that I noticed. How's the sorting going? Rough business, all this. Told Alden I'd help however I could. We're managing. Vance's tone eased, like he was doing us a favor just by mentioning it. You'll want to think about your options. Old place like this, taxes the way they are. There's people who'd take it off your hands quick, no fuss. Save you both the headache. His eyes flicked to Wren, and something harder came into his voice. No offense, Wren, but you're not exactly blood. Can't imagine you want to sink your savings into a house that was never really yours to begin with. I was on my feet before I decided to be. She's got the same claim to this house I do. Desmond made sure of that. You'll want to get used to it. Wren hadn't said a word since he'd arrived. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm as anything. I loved that man for 15 years before you ever bothered learning his birthday, Vance. Don't stand in his kitchen and tell me what I'm not. Vance's jaw tightened, but he didn't have an answer for that one. He held his hands up instead, the picture of innocence, and backed toward the door. Just looking out for family. Don't wait too long to decide, is all I'm saying. Places like this don't wait around for anybody. He left the way he'd come, unhurried, and I stood in the doorway watching his taillights disappear down the lake road. a low unease sitting in my chest that had nothing to do with the taxes. The roof started leaking over the back bedroom the following weekend, which meant the sorting gave way to actual work. The two of us up on a ladder passing tarps and nails back and forth in a rhythm neither of us had to think about. The kind of rhythm that comes back to a body even after 8 years of not using it. She held the ladder without being asked. I found myself handing her tools before she asked for them. Somewhere between hammering and not talking about anything that mattered, it got easier to be near her, the way a bruise gets easier to touch once the worst of the swelling goes down. "You still can't whistle." She watched me try and fail to call a tune I couldn't even name. "You still correct people's grammar in your head. I can see you doing it. I've never once corrected your grammar out loud. You didn't have to. Your face does it for you." She laughed, actually laughed, not the careful half sound she'd been giving me all week. And for one unguarded second, it was like no time had passed at all, before we both seemed to notice it and pulled back into safer territory. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally worked up the nerve to look for what Desmond's letter had pointed me toward. I found the journal exactly where he said it would be. Its leather cover soft with 40 years of handling. Most of it was what I expected. Fishing spots, weather notes, the names of birds he'd seen on the water that morning. But scattered through the last several years were shorter entries, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. "Ren stopped by today. Seemed tired. Didn't ask why. Talked to Asher on the phone. Sounds like he's working too much again. Same as always. Ren asked about him without meaning to. Told her he still fishes off the same dock. He'd been keeping track of both of us, quietly, for years, long after either of us had stopped keeping track of each other." Tucked between the last page and the cover was an envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed, my name written across the front in handwriting I'd have known anywhere, even after 8 years, smaller than Desmond's, more careful, the handwriting of someone who used to leave me notes under the porch swing cushion. I didn't open it. I sat with it a long time, and then I put it in my jacket pocket, next to where Desmond's letter had been the week before. And I understood, in a way I couldn't yet explain, that whatever was inside it wasn't only mine to open alone. I almost told her about the letter twice in the 2 days that followed. Once standing in the driveway as she was leaving, once on the phone when she called to ask if I'd found anything useful in the desk. Both times I said no, I hadn't found anything, and hung up feeling like exactly the kind of coward Desmond's note had warned me not to be. I brought Ren by the diner 2 days later, mostly because Nora had been asking after both of us, and mostly because I wasn't ready to hand over the letter yet and needed somewhere else to put my nervous energy. Nora was in the back storeroom on a step stool, reaching for a box of napkins on the top shelf, when I heard her call my name in a voice that didn't sound like the voice I'd known my whole life. By the time I got back there, she was on the floor, one hand pressed to the shelving, the right side of her face gone slack in a way that made my whole body go cold and clear at the same time, the particular clarity that 8 years of ambulance calls had trained into me. I knelt beside her, asked her to smile, watched the left side of her mouth lift and the right side stay where it was, asked her to raise both arms, watched the right one drift. "Ren," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Call 911. Tell them stroke symptoms. Tell them the time. That's what they'll need first." I kept my hand on Nora's shoulder, kept talking to her low and even, the voice I used on every call, the one that had nothing to do with how scared I actually was. "You're okay, Nora. I've got you. Stay right here with me." The ambulance took 11 minutes, the longest 11 minutes I'd sat through in years, mostly because for once I wasn't the one arriving, I was the one waiting, and waiting had never been the part of this job I was good at. I rode with her to the hospital in Rutland, while Ren followed in her own car. We sat afterward in a waiting room under lights that made everything look slightly ill, Ren's knee bouncing against mine without either of us seeming to notice, until a nurse finally came out to tell us Nora was already asking for both of us by name, which struck me as good a sign as any. It was close to midnight before a doctor came out to tell us it had been a minor stroke, caught early enough that they expected a full recovery, and that whoever got her help that fast had likely saved her from something far worse. Ren and I sat afterward in the hospital parking lot, both of us too wired to drive yet, the adrenaline draining out of us in that shaky, useless way it does once the emergency ends and there's nothing left to do but feel it. She was staring at the dashboard. I forgot how still you get, right when everything else is falling apart. It's easier with strangers, I admitted, and it surprised me how easily it came out, sitting there in the dark. I can walk into the worst thing that's ever happened to somebody and know exactly what to do, and I couldn't pick up a phone and ask you why you'd stopped answering mine. She didn't say anything to that. Neither did I. We just sat there, the hospital lights buzzing overhead, both of us further out on a limb than either of us had been in 8 years. Word travels fast in a town the size of Millbrook, and it hadn't even been 2 full days before Vance's truck was back in the driveway, this time with a man I didn't recognize climbing out of the passenger side in a coat too clean for lake country. He extended a hand I didn't take. Preston Kane, Regional Development Lead for Halcyon Shoreline Group. He had the kind of smile that had clearly worked on other people before us. Vance used the particular gentleness people use right before they ask you for something. Rough week, I heard. Nora giving everybody a scare like that. Makes you think, doesn't it? Life's too short to be up on a roof patching shingles you can't afford, worrying about a tax bill that isn't going anywhere. Preston Kane had a folder of his own, glossy where ours were coffee-stained, and started talking numbers before either of us had said a word. A fast close, no inspections, no fuss, cash enough to clear what was owed and walk away with something left over. We understand this is a lot to manage, especially with everything else you've both got going on. Ren cut in before I could, flat and certain in a way that settled something in my chest. We're not selling. Vance's smile thinned. You've got what, 2 weeks left now? Less? He said it too easily, too precisely, for a man who was supposedly only casually aware of our situation. And I felt Ren go still beside me at the exact same moment I did, both of us hearing it, neither of us saying anything yet. We'll manage it. Preston Kane looked between the two of us, recalculated something behind his eyes, and left his card on the porch railing instead of in either of our hands. In case you change your minds, the two of them left the way men like that always leave, unhurried, certain we'd come around eventually. Nora called that evening from her daughter's spare room, already fighting doctor's orders to rest, wanting to know if we needed anything, and half the town seemed to have heard about the diner by then. 3 separate neighbors left casseroles on my porch by Thursday, none of them asked for. One of them was Frank Delgado from the hardware store, who'd sold Desmond lumber for 30 years on a running tab he never once collected on time. He didn't say much, just set a foil-covered dish on the step. Your uncle vouched for me with the bank once, back when nobody else would. Least I can do is make sure you two eat something this week. Then he was gone before I could think of anything to say back, and it struck me, standing there with a casserole dish in my hands, as a kind of answer to the cold, efficient math Preston Kane had tried to hand us. Ren was quiet the whole drive back to the house that evening, and I mistook it for exhaustion until she stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed. How long were you going to let him say things like that without telling me you knew the deadline was closer than we thought? I didn't know he knew. That's not the same as hiding it. Isn't it, though? You go quiet exactly when it matters most. You did it 8 years ago, and you're doing it right now. She wasn't yelling. It might have been easier if she was. I drove 3 hours every few weeks to sit with a dying man because I couldn't stand the thought of him being alone. And I never once told you, because I didn't think you'd notice either way. That's not fair. No, it isn't. None of this has been fair. Least of all the part where I stood outside that screen door 8 years ago and heard you tell your uncle it would be kinder to let me go before you turned into someone who held me back. The kitchen went very quiet. You heard that. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of 8 years of a story I'd told myself, finally cracking down the middle. Every word of it. I'd driven over to tell you I got into the program in Boston, and I was so happy, and I stood right there on the porch and heard you say you were going to let me go, and I left before you even knew I'd come. I told myself I was doing you a favor, getting out before you had to be the one to say it. My voice wasn't quite steady now. I wasn't talking about letting you go from me. I was talking about letting go of my own fear. I'd just started paramedic training, and I was terrified I was going to fail out of it. And terrified that if I didn't, you'd spend 2 years in Boston wondering if you should have stayed with somebody more sure of himself. I told Desmond I thought the kind thing might be to end it clean before I turned into somebody who made you feel guilty for leaving. I never got to say the rest of it, because you'd gone quiet on me by the time I called that week, and I was too proud to ask why. Ren pressed a hand over her mouth, and I watched 8 years rearrange themselves behind her eyes in real time. I wrote you a letter that same week, everything I was too scared to say out loud. I left it in Desmond's lake journal because I couldn't make myself hand it to you, and I told myself I'd come back for it once I found the courage. And then Boston happened, and I never did. I took a breath. I know, I found it. I've had it in my pocket for 4 days. I took it out and set it on the counter between us, the same worn envelope, her handwriting on the front, my name in it 8 years old and still perfectly legible. She stared at it like it might combust. You didn't read it. Desmond didn't read past the first line either. Said it wasn't his to read. Figured that made 2 of us. She picked it up, but didn't open it. Instead, she held it against her chest, both hands over it, and told me, in her own voice, present tense, 8 years late, everything that letter had been trying to say, that she'd been terrified he'd let her go so easily. That she'd spent the drive to Boston convincing herself it didn't matter, and never quite managed to convince herself all the way. That she used to write to Desmond because writing to him was the closest she could get to writing to me, without admitting that's what she was doing. That she'd never once, in 8 years, stopped comparing every steady man she met to the one who used to sit beside her on a porch swing built for 1 person and somehow make room for 2. Her voice caught. I've fallen in love with you twice. Once when I was 22 and didn't know any better, and again this week, watching you keep an old woman alive on a diner floor, and then come home and still find a way to hand a boy a hammer like it was the most natural thing in the world. I crossed the kitchen and kissed her before I could talk myself out of it. Careful at first, the way you touch something you're not sure is still yours to touch. And then not careful at all, both of us finally saying with our hands and mouths what 8 years of pride had refused to let us say out loud. We stayed in that kitchen a long time after, her back against the counter and my forehead resting against hers, neither of us in any hurry to be the one who stepped back first. We still have a house to save, she murmured eventually, not moving. Tomorrow. Tonight I'm just going to stand here and not be an idiot about this for once. She laughed against my mouth, and for a while that was answer enough for both of us. We drove out to see Nora the next morning, still recovering but sharp as ever, propped up on her daughter's couch with a blanket she kept insisting she didn't need. She confirmed what she'd only hinted at before. She'd watched Vance pick up Desmond's mail almost every week that past year. And once, only once, she'd seen him toss what looked like a town envelope straight into his truck instead of carrying it up to the porch. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured he was just being helpful. Should have known better. That boy's never done a helpful thing that didn't circle back around to him. Back at the house that afternoon, Ren found the rest of it, tucked behind the same seed catalogs where the tax notices had been hiding. A glossy halcyon shoreline folder, property lines sketched in the margins in handwriting I recognized as Vance's, dated nearly a year before Desmond died. Her professional eye caught every detail I would have missed. The estimated lot value circled twice, a number beside it that made my jaw tighten. He was measuring this place before Desmond was even gone. We went to the town office ourselves that same week. The clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set man named Foster who'd clearly had this exact conversation more times than he cared to count, looked almost surprised when Ren asked the question directly instead of assuming the answer. Payment plan. Sure, we do those all the time. 7,000 down. We spread the rest over 18 months, long as the paperwork's in before the sale date. Ren looked at me. I looked at her. We signed it right there at the counter and split the 7,000 between us before we let ourselves celebrate anything. It had taken less than 20 minutes to learn what Vance had spent weeks making sure we never asked. Nobody had ever mentioned it to us because Vance made sure of that, steering every conversation toward Preston Kane's cash offer and away from the town office 3 blocks from his own front door. Vance came back to the house one more time, Preston Kane a step behind him, expecting, I think, to find 2 exhausted people ready to sign whatever he put in front of them. Instead, he found Ren with the halcyon folder on the porch railing and Nora's account written out in my handwriting on the seat beside it. I didn't wait for him to start his pitch. You told us the town wouldn't work with us. You told us this deadline was airtight. You knew exactly how many days were left, because you're the one who let the first notices go unpaid. Preston Kane went very still, already backing toward his car, already a company distancing itself from a liability instead of a man defending his cousin. This is the first I'm hearing of any of this. Vance, we'll need to talk. He left without another word, taking whatever arrangement he'd promised Vance with him. Vance's composure cracked the way it always did once nobody useful was left to perform for. His voice rose. You have no idea what it was like, watching him leave everything to the 2 of you like I was never even in the picture. I needed this. You've got your job, she's got her career in Boston, and I've got a dealership 3 months from bankruptcy and a name on a will that says I get nothing. His voice cracked on the last word in a way that almost sounded honest. He used to take you fishing every single Sunday. Me, I got invited maybe twice a year, and only when my mother made him. For just a second, standing there on that porch, he looked less like a man running a scheme, and more like a kid still keeping score of a childhood that ended 25 years ago. Ren stepped forward before I could say anything else. You didn't just cost us weeks of sleep, Vance. You gambled with the one thing your uncle spent his whole life trying to hold together. That's not a business decision. That's just cruelty with a spreadsheet attached. You could have asked for help. Instead, you let an old man's tax bills rot in a drawer. He didn't have an answer for that. He got in his truck and left, and Alden called the following afternoon to say that deliberately taking and withholding a dying man's mail could amount to a federal postal offense, and that Vance would likely be spending more time with a lawyer of his own than he'd planned on that year. Alden helped us turn over what we had to the proper authorities. We didn't chase it any further than that. Some things settle themselves once the truth is finally out where everyone can see it. By the time the leaves turned that October, I understood something Desmond must have known long before either of us figured it out for ourselves, that the hardest repairs are never the ones you can patch with a tarp and a level. I found Ren on the porch one evening in early November, Desmond's lake journal open on her knees, a pen in her hand instead of a drafting pencil. What are you writing? I asked, settling onto the swing beside her, close enough that there wasn't room left for anybody to pretend otherwise. She turned the journal so I could read it. Fenwick Lake, first frost. Whole house, 2 names on the deed, and for the first time in 8 years, no half of anything left unsaid. Desmond would have liked that. Desmond would have said, "I told you so." She closed the journal and let me pull her the rest of the way into the space that had always, somehow, been built for 2.